Hello, everybody. We have, over the years, done a lot of shows about the impact of time on economics and politics. One show that comes to mind is one with the economist Charles Crowson on the short-termism that undermines how we think about money and value. Crowson has an interesting book, Jam Tomorrow, Why Time Really Matters in Economics. And of course, time really matters not just in economics, but in politics. We did a show with the Oxford thinker, Roman Krznaric, on how to be a good ancestor. Fascinating conversation and book. His book is called The Good Ancestor, a radical prescription for long-term thinking. We can't just think about our generation. Future generations are critical too. And we're back on long-termism and the role of time in thinking about politics with my guest today, Thomas Hale. He teaches at Oxford University, and his new book, Long Problems, Climate Change and the Challenge of Governing Across Time, addresses the whole question of global warming and time and politics. Tom Hale is joining us from Oxford. Tom, congratulations on the new book. I assume you're certainly familiar with Krznaric. I think he's an Oxford colleague of yours. This idea of everything being a long problem, is this a new problem, or is this something that we humans have always had to deal with throughout our history as a species?
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. It's really a pleasure to speak about this. And indeed, we have a lot of history here in Oxford, so lots of people thinking about this question of time. It's not a new problem. We've always had problems that stretch across more than one human generation, which is how I define long problems. But I think there are a few ways why now it's particularly relevant and urgent. We have a lot more impact on the world around us than we did before because of the rise of industrial production. We're pushing the boundaries of the planet on climate change, on nature, and a few other areas. And that means that human systems, which are naturally a little bit short term, are colliding with geoplanetary systems, which are much longer term. So the carbon we put in the air today, that's going to be there not just for our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, but for 1,000 years. The carbon that was burned in the first train to run the Industrial Revolution is still up there today looking down on us. So this is a collision between human timescales and planetary timescales that is new. And that's why long problems are not just maybe a new phenomenon overall, but actually quite urgent today.
When it comes to political institutions, Thomas, of course, our democratic governments have boundaries both in time and space. You do a lot of work with the United Nations. You were a COP26 fellow, one of the 4 fellows to inform the Glasgow summit back in, I think, 2020. Do we need new political institutions? Are the current political institutions in the UK? You've got UK government. Of course, you did have the EU, no longer. In the US, we only have the US federal government. Is one of the issues that you address in Long Problems the limits and perhaps the weaknesses of our current political structures?
That's indeed a big part of what I'm trying to talk about in the book. So it'd be surprising if this 1,000-year time span that I mentioned before, we have the same political institutions today that we have in 1,000 years. Just as you look back to the start of the Industrial Revolution, we had quite different institutions overall. But the fundamental point I want to make in the book is that we don't need something radically unheard of to govern long problems. It's actually about doing things we're already doing, but just doing them better and more systematically. So, for example, we have many institutions in the world today called central banks, which are a little bit independent of politics, arm's length institutions that have a technocratic mandate to provide long-term stability for the economy. And they do that under democratic systems, under autocratic systems. They do it because it's an important function that we need them to do. Why don't we have something like that for climate change, where people who set the price of money, that's what central banks do that for setting the price of carbon, for example. So the point is that it's not about radically changing what we're doing, but rather thinking more systematically about how we bring the tools we know work into the problems that are like climate change, where we need to do more. So it's not a panacea. There's no kind of silver bullet here, but there's 1,000 things we can build on. And that's, I think, the most hopeful message that comes out of the book.
I'm sure you're familiar with Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future, or rather dystopian vision of the future. in which there literally is a ministry of the future established by some sort of global organization. And of course, the Ministry of the Future, as a best-selling science fiction book, was designed as a wake-up call about the future. How urgent is this issue in your view, Thomas?
Well, I think it's incredibly urgent. People ask, how can we think about the long term in a world where we have war, we have debt crises, we have food shortages, we have all the things that are so important in the here and the now. And I think if you think about it for a second, you scratch the surface of some of these urgent crises, you see that many of them, indeed probably all of them to some degree, have a connection to a longer term, deeper trend that actually is at the root of it. And the COVID-19 pandemic was perhaps the best example of this in recent memory. So we knew that even though governments' reactions to the COVID crisis in the moment were really important, the more important thing is being prepared in advance and having some of the systems set up. That's what we've been told by scientists for a very long time. And so there's no way to kind of react your way out of these crises. The only way we can deal with the so-called polycrises is to get ahead of these trends and begin to make the long-term investments that are going to put us into a more resilient place in the future. And so even though there's this sort of, future aspect to it, it's actually about what we do here and now to make the choices that are going to improve the world for us and our successors in the time to come. So this kind of short-term versus long-term, I think, is the wrong framing. It's more about taking them as a holistic system and making the kinds of investments we need to do.
Tom, the nagging question at the back of my mind as I listen to you and as I think about your book is how this relates to democracy. You have maybe correct me if I'm wrong, or rather a technocratic view of the world. You suggest that all these issues can be resolved or at least approached through a sort of technocratic wisdom. What does this mean for democracy? If indeed we're all ancestors and we should be governing across time, what does that suggest about elections and the role of governments? Does that undermine the will of living people in your view?
So I think some of the things we need to do are about putting more technocratic solutions in place, but an equal measure of what we need to do is putting more democratic participatory institutions in place. So yes, we need to rely more on tools to help us look across the future, and those are often technocratic tools to help guide decision-making, but equally, we need to give people meaningful choices over their futures. And indeed, I think a lot of the current distrust we see in government, some of the people's doubts about democracy, are about the disconnect they feel from having meaningful choices over their futures. And so alongside things like central banks for climate change, we should think about things like central citizen assemblies that can maybe propose pathways forward for legislatures. So it's not about getting rid of representative democracy or somehow constraining it through technocracy. It's rather complementing our existing institutions with both more technocratic tools that are insulated from short-term politics and more participatory ones that help to round out the picture. I think it's both technocracy and democracy working hand in hand. And there's a kind of easy foil here, which is, we're so frustrated sometimes with our elections and our democratic systems. We think, wouldn't it just be better if we didn't have this pesky democracy thing? We just kind of have this long-term vision. Isn't that how it works in China? But if you take a step back and you look at different non-democratic systems around the world, you see pretty quickly that even though elections do have a kind of short-term function, an absence of elections is not the way to get rid of short-termism. Indeed, autocracies tend to be much more short-term on average than democracies. So democracy is not the problem. Democracy is actually part of the solution.
Yeah, I thought you were going to go down the citizen assembly route. We've done lots of shows about it. In fact, I made a movie about the role of citizen assemblies in Ireland. And the Irish, when they approached the issue of abortion, when it came to citizen assemblies, became a little bit more, shall we say, progressive and more accepting of the right for a woman to have an abortion. But what happens if it goes the other way, Tom? What happens if you have citizen assemblies and citizens meet and say, we just want to enjoy ourselves. We don't care about our kids or the kids of our kids. We don't even have kids. We're just going to have fun now. We're going to drive our cars. We're going to enjoy all the benefits of consumer capitalism. Why should we care about the future?
Well, I think any effective democratic process will have to, take that view into account. And there are people who certainly, I think, will make that case. I think it's really interesting, though, when you take people out of the kind of gladiatorial combat of politics you see represented in the media or on social media, they actually naturally find themselves in a more holistic space where they're less about winning the day, as political junkies kind of talk about these days, and more about thinking, what do we actually want for our community? How do we build that together? And yes, they will disagree. Some will probably say we want more, less hassle, more short-term benefit. But people have what my colleague Roman calls this acorn brain alongside their marshmallow brain, meaning they have the ability to invest long-term for their kids' benefit. They have the ability to think about the communities they want to live in and how they want that to be for not just themselves, but their future. And so citizen assemblies, I think, are a much better way to tap into that than sort of the superficial act of participation in many democracies we have today.
You mentioned the Chinese model, which tends to be, as you suggested, a little bit more short-termist than some people think. What about the rise, Tom, of neo-authoritarianism or populism in the West, particularly the sort of the Trumpist model, which seems to be aggressively short-termist? How do you make sense of that, not just as an ideology, but also in terms of its success?
Well, one of my worries is that in a more turbulent world, which, for example, if we don't mitigate climate change effectively, we may face, if we don't adapt to it effectively, we may face, we'll see more political juice, more political fuel going toward these kinds of politics than not. And the reason is people really want to have control over their lives. When they feel they've lost that control, they react badly. They try to seize it back. They try to imagine some maybe mythological time when they had such control. I think that kind of populist impulse is one that a failure to take long-term action will only fuel. Imagine you're the mayor of a Middle Eastern city, and it's been over 50 degrees Celsius for the past night for a week in a row. Are you going to take a long-term investment in that time, or are you going to kind of think what short-term protection looks like? If you have huge numbers of climate migrants, are you going to take an enlightened view of how do we make the right kinds of investments into making it easier for people to adapt to the conditions they face, or are you going to build this kind of fortress to keep people out? So I think there's a real worry that populist politics is speaking to these trends, but in a way that could actually make the long-term success of them much harder to build up. So it's indeed a concern.
We're messy people, though. We're a messy species, Tom. Again, you don't need me to tell you this. We're not quite as rational, perhaps, as you'd like us to be. We're not computers. We have passions. We're not always as rational as perhaps even we would like to be. And we make mistakes, and that's the nature of human history. How would you respond to that kind of critique of your approach to the world?
So I think my approach is very much based on that view of human nature. It's James Madison, the founder of the framer of the American Constitution, who said, if men were angels, then no government would be necessary. And so the whole reason to focus on institutions and think about how we structure our decision-making is precisely we know that we're not going to have a sort of republic of enlightened individuals who are always going to be thinking about the long term, thinking about the enlightened self-interest. They're going to be messy, as you say. We're going to be focused on the immediate, on the here and now. And so the design question is not how do we somehow wave a magic wand and make ourselves into angels. It's rather how do we design institutions that can do long-term governance in a world as it is. And that's where I'm trying to explore in the book. And again, the positive message I find is that this happens all over the place, all the time. It's not something that's sort of mythological or optimistic or idealistic. It's something that we just need to build on the existing practices we have and make them much more mainstream.
Madison, of course, when he was talking about us not being angels, suggested we're self-interested. He didn't suggest we're irrational, though. There's a difference. How would you, are you a Madisonian in the sense that you think we're defined by our self-interest or designed by our lack of reason?
I think we're very good at knowing what ultimately we want. And I think that idea of what we want does change over time. It sometimes is defined in narrow material concerns, but I think often we're learning in recent years how that can be defined really by a sense of dignity, by a sense of belonging. And I think some of the political trends of recent years, for example, the rise of populism, are characterized by a displacement that's been caused by maybe economic dislocation or cultural changes that then challenges people's sense of dignity, challenges their sense of belonging. But I think those are very rational responses, if you understand our psychology appropriately. So I take a sort of, if you will, James Madison meets Daniel Kahneman view of the world and say we are rational, but there's some pretty systematic ways in which we define self-interest.
So you're suggesting with those things that we often vote or behave against our interests. It's the old Thomas Frank argument about what's the matter with Kansas. I mean, are you, if not contemptuous, critical of people who vote against their interests, either as individuals or perhaps collectively as a species?
Well, as a political scientist, I'm not contemptuous or critical of anyone's voting processes. I'm trying to understand them as a way to learn how we can maybe organize a world most effectively. And people's when someone votes against what we perceive to be their material self-interest, is either one of two things true. One, we haven't understood their material interests correctly, or two, they're not interested in material factors and they're interested in something else. And like I said, I think many people who are voting quote unquote against their material interests are voting because they feel that they're being represented by some kind of identity or a sense of belonging or sense of dignity that actually is more important to them than their understanding of what the government does or doesn't do in terms of tax benefits or welfare transfers or those kinds of things. And so I think that's the big learning I would take away from the last few years of populism.
We're speaking with Thomas Hale from Oxford University, the author of a really interesting new book, Long Problems, Climate Change and the Challenge of Governing Across Time. I want to thank our friends at Liberties, a quarterly publication of culture and politics, for bringing us such great guests as Thomas Hale. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Thomas Hale to talk about the institutions of governing across time. I want to talk about the United Nations and other potential institutions of the future. So we'll be back in a second. Don't go away, anyone. We're watching you. Short-termism rather than the long term.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought, a quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Thomas Hale, author of Long Problems, a very interesting book about time and challenges, particularly environmental challenges. Tom, you're a big UN guy, for better or worse. You, as I said, you were one of the 4 COP26 fellows. You're very much a supporter of the United Nations initiative for racing to a better world. You seem to be involved on lots of fronts on the UN. Some people might say the UN is a large bureaucracy, highly politicized. Everyone's in their own way self-interest and dressing up that self-interest in the language of kind of international bureaucracy. How would you respond? Are you confident that the United Nations as an institution can build some of the initiatives that you're in favor of in Long Problems?
So I would put myself in the camp of those who have pointed out to the various deficiencies and difficulties that come with a global organization that's guided fundamentally by 196 bosses, people who are its controllers are sovereign states who, of course, want to advance their own interests and don't always want to work together. So any organization that exists under those conditions is going to have lots of complexities and wrinkles. But despite all of that, I think it's very much the case if we didn't have something like the UN, we would have to invent it, because having that kind of body can achieve certain things that help us all, which even the most venal, self-interested states decide they want every now and then. So it's something that we can't do without. What can it do well? I think it's really good in this area of long-term problems for helping to do 2 things. One, goal setting, helping to articulate a legitimate collective sense of what our purpose should be, we're trying to achieve. And 2, information provision, helping countries understand and define the problem in a way that actually is based on science and reason. And that seems, maybe not so consequential. It's not about forcing people to do something they wouldn't want to do. That's not realistic. That's not what the UN could ever do. But actually these 2 functions, goal setting and information provision, are hugely influential. And if we didn't have them, we'd have to invent them.
I know that the UN has something called the Summit of the Future later this year. Multilateral solutions for a better world. I'm guessing you're going to be part of that. What would you like the UN Summit of the Future to address in a couple of months?
So Summit of the Future comes from a report that was published on the 75th anniversary of the UN. is published to basically ask the question, how do we make this institution fit for purpose going forward? How can it serve the world, not just of 1945, but also the world of 2024 and beyond? And there's obviously many, many things that we'd like to see changed. One of the pieces, though, I'm most excited about is this idea of having a declaration on future generations and some tools to help countries implement that declaration. What that would do is actually make a commitment in international law to safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. And UN declarations, like I said, they're not going to be a police. There's not a police force behind them. They're not going to like go in and tax people or change things by force. But what it can do is set an aspiration, set a goal, and create a process through which countries can learn how to do that. And so this is the kind of catalyst that we saw, for example, drive forward the creation of human rights as a governance system. That came from a declaration like this. And I think we need a similar transformation in how we approach politics if we're going to get ahead of these long problems.
You mentioned human rights, of course. That was an initiative by, I think, Eleanor Roosevelt at the beginning of the Cold War. But the period after the creation of the UN was a period of pretty awful human rights on lots of fronts. How confident are you that this will actually have an impact on the world and it won't just be another meeting of bloviators who are self-congratulatory and then they go back and commit all the crimes that they're supposed to be fixing?
Well, that is indeed the challenge. And so it's really the pressure is on. Governments have this opportunity. They have, I would say, a once in a generation chance to try to do something to show that they actually meaningfully want to commit to a longer term governance vision and to agree on that. And the negotiations are happening now. They'll continue through the summer. We need to see countries step up. What I find very encouraging, though, is that a number of them, and I think of some champions here like Costa Rica or Mexico or Finland or Kenya, have put forward really ambitious visions, actually. So in Kenya, I was there a few weeks ago, the Kenyan Senate now has a Futures Caucus, which is going to review all the legislature that comes through the Kenyan Senate for how is it going to impact the future, right? So it's a very practical step that's being done by a country that doesn't have a lot of resources, but still has the commitment politically to try to do something better for the rapidly expanding population that they have. So maybe the UN can benefit from this kind of practical implementation focus that a number of countries are bringing into the mix.
Costa Rica always comes up in these sorts of conversations, like Denmark, perhaps. Interesting that Mexico has just elected certainly a progressive left-wing president that might change Mexican policy. But the US, China, India, Russia, these are not countries that you bring up. Can small countries like Costa Rica shape the future, or is it just, again, more bloviating at UN summits, Thomas?
Well, I think actually every country here has something to teach and something to learn. So in the United States, I think there's a really powerful innovation that the federal government has, is something called the social cost of carbon. This is an accounting rule that federal agencies use when making their cost-benefit analyses. It's a way to put long-term perspectives into the fundamental cost-benefit analysis that goes into all legislative, regulatory rulemaking in the U.S. So it's not, the U.S. has actually something quite positive, I think, to bring to this story. China has a system that has some real short-termism to it, but also some quite useful things about how to set long-term goals and to create incentives for working across government toward them. Saudi Arabia has a quite ambitious strategy for 2030 and a kind of interesting model of using a huge sovereign wealth fund to make long-term investments to drive transformation. So even countries that have, shall we say, a lot of self-interest and some mixed records on some of the core issues we face still have these seeds of green shoots, if you will, of innovation that I think we can all learn from and indeed strengthen.
So should we be working with countries like Saudi Arabia? Has a terrible human rights record. We've done a number of shows on that. Are there some countries, maybe Russia, for example, that are beyond the pale in terms of these international organizations? Or are you as an internationalist and someone who wants to address these long-term problems, can we work with anyone?
So I think you have to think about what you're trying to achieve. I think a system like the UN is by definition one where equal sovereign states come together. And it needs to be, we need to have some space in the world where people who disagree with each other fundamentally, the North Koreas and the South Koreas, the Iran's and the Saudi Arabias, the United States and the Chinas, we all need to have some kind of process that allows us to have those exchanges. We're all safer and better off if we have that system. So it's not about trying to have harmony. It's about finding ways to manage our disagreements. And I think international institutions are very useful tools for that. That's why states keep them around, even if they also like to scapegoat them. But it's not also about, by the same token, thinking here's like a perfect country and here's a country that's terrible and we all need to follow the perfect country. There's no country in the world that's perfect. The Denmarks and Costa Ricas have some warts and wrinkles as well.
Denmark, Thomas, even they have warts. I haven't noticed any, but maybe that's
you might have heard about the huge mink cull they had to undertake during COVID, where
I'm joking. I know the Danes aren't perfect. Some people think. You're in the business also of writing declarations on the future. You co-authored something called Toward a Declaration on Future Generations with 3 other authors, Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's been on the show a couple of times, Toby Ord, who's very much associated with the radical altruist movement. Are you yourself a radical altruist? Is the ideology, if that's the right word, underpinning a lot of your thinking in the new book and in your declaration for future generations? Is it a manifestation, a document of radical altruism?
No. So I would not characterize myself as an effective altruist. I'm someone who thinks very much about the how, not the why. Effective altruism is a philosophical movement driven by sort of form of utilitarianism, who think we should really focus on the future because there's a lot of people to come, and therefore, from a kind of adding it all up picture, the future is quite big, and we should therefore prioritize it. That's not the philosophy I subscribe to, and it's not my motivation for thinking about this. I think it's really fascinating how we have so many different belief systems, like effective altruism, like Burkean conservatism, like ecologicalism, all these ideas that converge on this idea we should try to do something better for the future. In my book, which is a positive political science kind of contribution, is about how, if we do want to value the future, how we could do that. So, I think the effective altruism movement has had some difficulties with their engagement in the policy space. This is a book, my book is one about a practical guide for how we do better on long-term governance, no matter what our philosophical underpinning for wanting to do that might be.
Yeah, it's interesting that in our age of political divisions, where no one seems to be able to talk to one another, you bring up Burkean long-termism, Thomas Burke, of course, being the father of modern conservatism, and then the radical altruism of people like Toby Ord. Do you think this issue of long problems, climate change, and the challenging of governing across time could be one area to bring together conservatives and liberals, progressives and others?
I do think so. I think there's a few things that are really deep moral intuitions, and leaving the world a better place for your people to come after you is one of those. You see it in indigenous traditions around the world. People who are completely disconnected from each other seem to come to the same conclusion on this, and have throughout history. Doesn't mean we're going to agree on what the future should be, right? So if you had a citizens' assembly and you brought together the conservatives and the ecologists and the techno-optimists and everyone else and said, what do we want to have? They probably would have quite different visions for what that future might look like. But all of them, I think, could be invested in the process of thinking about how we should, we think it's a worthwhile project to have that conversation. And I think in that you find the spirit of political compromise, or at least political community that we can, I think is sorely needed in our present age of division.
Thomas, you bring up the techno-optimists. They are everywhere, certainly where I am in San Francisco. We've had many on the show. Techno-optimists embrace the idea of a utopia built around 21st century technology, particularly AI. It sounds to me as if AI could be programmed to address lots of the long-term problems that you write about in your book. What is the role of AI? Are you an optimist when it comes to using AI to address long problems, or is it more of a chilling prospect? Of course, AI is a very divisive issue. Some people are incredibly excited about it. Others are deeply fearful.
So I think there's a lot of people who are worried about AI as a long problem. If we have something where a technology may develop over time in a way we can't control, what steps we take now in the present to prevent that from happening is, obviously motivating a lot of the thinking there. I think that's a good example of a general problem of how do you, regulate things that you can't necessarily predict where they're going to be. So I think in that sense, it's definitely relevant. Well, whether AI will itself be useful for managing these things, I think is still very much an open question. To my mind, the best use case is around organizing complex information. So we can only perceive climate change as a scientific reality because of this huge organization we've created to put human knowledge of different kinds, ice core samples, historic handwritten log notes from centuries ago, all sorts of modeling systems together into this big machine of human knowledge. And so AI will be helpful for that kind of understanding complexity. Whether it's going to be a decision-making tool, I think that's probably a bit far-fetched.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see whether we can come up with a planetary algorithm that everyone trusts. Finally, Thomas Hale, author of Long Problems. I'm going to turn the tables on you. Of course, Keynes argued that in the long run, we're all dead. And to get to the long term, we've got to deal with the short term. In terms of addressing all your long problems that you talk about in the new book, perhaps you might list 2 or 3 short-term strategies that will allow us to build a Clintonian bridge to long problems. What can we do in the next 3 to 5 years to address long problems?
So I think on the climate change front, which is what I read about mostly in the book, there's a few very practical things that we already have examples of working around the world that could be replicated and put into other systems. One actually comes from where you are in California. The California Air Resources Board is a good example of a relatively independent, autonomous, technocratic agency that operates under democratic control to provide long-term stability to climate policy. And I think that's innovation that many governments would benefit from. Secondly, I think we have a real opportunity to use the courts more effectively, right? We have all these cases moving forward in a bit of a haphazard way, trying to make future generations real in the present by suing companies or countries for not doing enough on climate change. So that's a very promising tactic, I think, for correcting some of this. And finally, the one that you've done this movie about, citizen assemblies. Here's a tool to really leverage and connect to, especially young people who are feeling a bit marginalized from political participation today, to give them a really meaningful way to control their futures and to provide that link back to democratic accountability. So 3 things we could do, we already are doing to some extent, that we could do